In this lecture, we're going to move on to the next step, which is creating child components. We already saw how to do this previously, but there are a couple of additional things I want to show you. What we'll do is put the greeting into its own component. It shouldn't be difficult to pull off. In fact, why don't you give it a try? Try creating a greeting component with a dynamic message. Then try loading it inside the app component. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. If you were able to take on the challenge, then congrats. If not, that's fine as well. We'll do it together. The first step is to create the file. It's always good practice to keep your components organized. We'll place our child components inside a separate directory. Inside the source directory, create a folder called Components. Inside this newly created directory, create a file called greeting.vue. It's common practice to use camel casing for your component names. It's not required, but recommended. Inside this file, we'll want to add the template and script blocks. We can type those blocks out, but there's an easier way to create them. Switch over to the Extensions tab. There's an extension created by the community of Vue for creating components. Search for an extension called Vue VS Code Snippets by a user called Sarah Drasner. Install this extension on your editor. It's going to be helpful. After installing it, switch back to the greeting component. If I start typing Vue, then Visual Studio Code will provide me with a drop-down of snippets I can add to the file. This is possible thanks to the Vtur extension we installed. If you're not using either of those, then you'll need to type out the blocks manually. You can select any of these options and Visual Studio Code will pre-fill your file with the snippet you selected. I typically like to go with the very first one. After selecting it, all three blocks are inserted for us. We're going to remove the style block because we won't be using it. In addition, the setup attribute can be removed. For the rest of this course, I'm going to use this shortcut whenever we create single file components. Unless I say otherwise, I will also remove the style block whenever I do so. It's not something we will use often. Let's continue working on the component. For the template, we're going to cut and paste the paragraph element from the app component to the greeting component like so. Next, we're going to copy the contents of the script block from the app component. We'll paste it into the greeting component. We're going to need to make one change to the greeting component. We'll change the name to greeting. We're finished with prepping the greeting component. The next step is to load this component inside the app component. Switching back to the app component, we don't need the data property anymore. It has been moved into its own component. Therefore, we'll remove the data function. The next step is to load the component. There are two ways to load a component. You can do it on a global level and on a local level. We learned how to do it on the global level previously. To register a component globally, we need to use the component method. Let's use this method inside the main.js file. This is the file where we are initializing the Vue application. We'll need to make some adjustments to the way we initialize the application. Currently, we're chaining the mount method. However, we need to register the component before we mount the application. We'll separate this by assigning the returned value from the function to a variable called VM. Afterward, we'll chain the mount method to the variable. In between these two lines, we'll register the component. Components must be registered after a Vue instance. We'll call the component method on the VM variable. At the top, we'll import the greeting component. There are two things I want to quickly note about this import statement. We're including the Vue extension in the import statement. We need to make sure Webpack understands we're importing a single file component. Be sure to include this extension in the import statement. Secondly, the name of the import is called greeting. This is the same name in the component's name property. This is common practice so that it's easier to find the component, but you can call it whatever you want. You don't have to use the name you assigned in the name property or the file name. From here, we can pass in the name of the component, which will be greeting, and then the component itself. We don't have to worry about passing this in as an object. Webpack will compile it into an object. Vue will understand what we're trying to do. This is how you register a component globally. Global components can be used anywhere in Vue. This includes children components. However, this usually isn't recommended. Global components tend to make optimization harder for module bundlers like Webpack. Our application will still work, but it's best practice to register a component locally. That way you don't end up loading every single component in your application, even the ones that aren't active. Let's learn how to do that. We're going to comment out both lines. Local components can only be used in the component it was registered in. The app component is the only component we have that will be using the greeting component. To register a component locally, we can add a property to the configuration called components. The value for this property is an object. The object will contain a list of components that can be used inside this component. Like last time, we'll need to import the greeting component. Next, we'll add a new property to the object where the key name will be the name of the component and the value will be the component itself. The key name will be greeting. The value will be the greeting component. Thanks to ES 2015, we can shorten this to greeting. It'll automatically be interpreted to what we previously had. This is how you register a component locally. The components property allows you to specify what components the current component can use. The last step is to use the local component. In the app components template, we'll add a pair of tags with the name greeting. Let's refresh the page in the browser. We will still see the greeting in the document. Using the Vue DevTools, we'll find the greeting component nested inside the app component. This confirms that our app is using the greeting component we registered. Checking the DevTools is a great way to verify if a component is being registered successfully. Vue gives us the flexibility of registering a component globally or locally. I always recommend local registration unless you know for sure that a component will be used in multiple locations. In the end, it's completely up to you. It's all preference.